Future Warrior, The Mars Campaign. Chapter 1. The breeze picked up, a low moan growing on the wind, the haunting sound giving a voice to the desolate red wastes. As its strength grew more and more fine, particles of red sand were whipped up and carried away, giving a face to the growing storm. It came out of the barren sandy wastes to the east, a vortex of swirling sand hundreds of kilometers across, created by an unusual convergence of weather patterns. As it swept westwards, it had grown in intensity, the winds at its core reaching hurricane strength. It was the first major storm of its type for several decades, the intense weather patterns long since thought eradicated by the planetary engineers who had terraformed Mars. It was as if the red planet was reminding those who had sought to tame it that it could still break free and run wild as it had done for eons before the coming of the first human settlers. As the storm crossed the border of the region of Elysium, it encountered its first man-made object, the wind and airborne sand beginning to crash into and pile up against a small structure built into the edge of a rocky outcrop. Between the swirling gusts of sand words were visible on the small buildings, "Only Door," faded sand-blasted letters reading, "Saul Milroy Mining Inc." Inside the building, a single occupant sat quietly listening to the tempest building outside. Saul Milroy wasn't concerned by the howling baying wind. He had seen many sandstorms in his life, and he was certain that this wouldn't be the last. Despite the ample power in his solar reserves, he preferred to sit in the dark as the storm raged. Only the glow of his pipe and a portable heating unit revealed his hard-weathered features, his hair thin and slightly graying, the result of over 40 years spent in the Martian wastes. He coughed, swearing to himself. The tobacco was coarse and rough on his throat, the product of a grower on the outskirts of Elysium Prime, who still grew small amounts of the plant that was virtually impossible to obtain anywhere else in the health-conscious Martian colony. Saul drew heavily one last time, then knocked the contents of the pipe out onto the floor, stubbing out the glowing embers with the well-worn leather heel of his boot. Saul was the end of an era and a way of life, and he knew it. He was amongst the last of the hard prospectors and explorers who, since the first settlement of the Red Planet, had come to Mars and cut their teeth in the barren wastes seeking fortune. Back when he had first come to Mars, the cities had been smaller, the air thinner, and the waste remoter and largely unexplored. Much had changed since those days. Millions of people had migrated to the Red Planet. The terraforming processes had stabilized the climate, and the big corporations had squeezed out the small operators and prospectors to set up the massive mining complexes that now exported countless tons of minerals to the hungry factories of Earth and the outer colonies. It had been a more reckless time, a time when deals were done, promises made and broken, and fortunes were won and lost in the desert wastes. From the moment he had arrived on Mars as a young geologist, Saul had fallen in love with the life. Free from the rigid constraints and regulations of Earth, a man was able to walk his own path and shape his own destiny as he went along. He had spent his youth searching the outer wastes for rare and valuable minerals, staking claims, making money, and losing money. It had been a carefree but dangerous life, for Mars was not a kind mistress to those who sought to claim her. He had survived sandstorms that could strip the flesh from the unprotected body, mechanical breakdowns far from help or civilization, broken bones from rockfalls, near death from thirst, and areas of soft sand that could swallow the unwary without trace. He threw a glance to a dark shape on the wall outlined by the half-light thrown by the heating unit at his feet, the distinctive long shape of his trusty rifle that had been at his side through thick and thin. It was a bolt-action 5-shot hunting rifle that used old-fashioned, smokeless gunpowder cartridges, the weapon having already been an antique when he had swapped it for a handful of gold dust and a bottle of real earth whiskey over 3 decades before. Since that time, the rifle had traveled with him everywhere and had the scars and dents to prove it. There was, of course, nothing to hunt on Mars, but in the early days, the Red Planet's isolated wastes had held dangers. Bandits and criminal gangs had lurked in the deserted wastes, ready to murder or leave stranded the unwary. After them had come the hired thugs of the mining corporations, who used threats, violence, and murder to remove the small prospectors and mining operations from areas and finds they wished to claim for themselves. Saul had left more than one body buried in the red sand in those early years, but in the end he, like the others, had been driven from the richest areas, many choosing to leave Mars for the outer colonies and new opportunities. Saul, however, had decided to stay, relying on his skills, luck, and the red planet to provide him with a living. At current, his skills and luck had brought him to his present home on the edge of Elysium, a move that had also brought a steady flow of wealth. The area of his claim and the vast expanse over which he had acquired prospecting rights had turned out to be quite rich in valuable gemstones, particularly high-quality peridot. Formed in basalt lava deposits from volcanic eruptions and found at the site of palisite meteorite impacts, the gemstones were made from the mineral olivine and were a valuable find for the professional prospector. Used in jewelry since ancient times on Earth, notably by the Egyptians and Romans, the gemstones were especially valuable on Mars for their brilliant green color, which was highly desired in a place dominated by shades of red and brown. Since settling into the area 6 years ago, he had been finding a constant stream of high-quality stones of impressive size, his largest as big as an orange, with perfect deep green coloration. Despite his recent success, he knew that luck could change as quickly as the wind, and that it was just as fickle. Still, for the moment at least, he could afford to relax. He had collected a range of high-quality stones over the past few weeks that would guarantee him a healthy return. The morning would bring an end to the storm, and he would make his way to the nearest major town, the aptly named Silica City, where his regular gem buyer would turn his finds into profit, which he would in turn convert into fresh supplies. It was a trip he only made once a month at most. His years spent mostly alone in the wilderness, giving him a lackluster at best interest in small talk and rubbing shoulders with those who rarely left the comfort and security of the urban centers. Saul reached down and touched the small bag of gemstones in his pocket, his expert touch remembering each stone without needing to look. Satisfied that they were all still there, he closed his eyes, letting the sound of the storm sing him to sleep. He awoke with a start, not sure at first what had stirred him from his sleep. It was then he noticed the thin streams of sunlight coming in through the single reinforced plexiglass window of his cabin. He had not remembered dozing off, but many years of rising before dawn had left their mark, and he now found it virtually impossible to remain asleep once the sun had risen. He rose from the chair to a chorus of clicks from his back, the noise audibly louder due to several replaced titanium vertebrae from a rockfall accident several years before. After quickly eating and gathering up his travel clothes, he grabbed his rifle and opened the door. The door crunched open with a shove, a small bank of sand having built up against the building and across the doorway. Saul took a deep breath. The air was fresh and clear after the storm, his breath producing small clouds of steam as it met the frigid morning air. He took a moment to take in the new surroundings, the storm having altered the landscape during the night, the dunes moving and disappearing at the whim of the storm. He then turned his attention to preparing his vehicle, a rugged off-road track prospecting truck he had bought at a mine surplus sale. After carefully removing the cover, he ensured that the truck was free of the ever-invasive sand. Once satisfied, he tried the ignition, the vehicle's hybrid solar cell engine roaring to life as he knew it would. And after a quick check of his navigation system, he rolled out into the sandy wastes. As soon as he pulled away from the small structure that was his home and the rocky outcrop into which it was built into, he caught his first view of the wider world, one feature drawing his attention, as it had ever since he had first laid eyes on it, the immense towering monolith of Olympus Mons. Rising behind his home like a staircase of the gods, Olympus Mons was the highest mountain in the solar system. Almost 3 times taller than the highest peaks on Earth, Olympus Mons soared to 27 kilometers above the median surface level of Mars. As a geologist, the immense monolith amazed him in a scientific as well as a spiritual way. He knew that it was in fact a single giant volcano, its base stretching 550 kilometers across, while at the top of its gently sloping sides lay a vast crater containing 6 separate calderas, the cone stretching 60 kilometers wide and up to 3 kilometers deep at its lowest point. He had, of course, known about the mountain before he had come to Mars, and in his youth had climbed to its summit to gaze upon the planet he was to come to call home. His trip doing what many thrill seekers and tourists had done since, to take in the greatest view in the known galaxy. It was after seeing the great mountain and the wonders of Mars that he had fallen in love with the planet's rugged beauty and desolate serenity, deciding to stay and discover its secrets. As he headed away from the volcano, he threw it a wave, a courtesy for the mountain's generosity, its ancient fiery past being the reason for his current success. His now traditional homage paid to the mountain, he refocused on the desert and the long trip to Silica City, keeping a sharp eye on the constantly changing terrain for dangers as he negotiated the low dunes and rocky outcrops at a steady pace. He had been traveling for several hours when he saw an approaching plume of dust on the horizon. Carefully, he pulled behind the crest of a high dune and stopped, his natural caution born of years of meeting the unexpected taking over. Grabbing his rifle, he climbed the dune and lay in wait, watching the dust through the antique weapon's telescopic sight, commonly called a scope. As it got nearer, he made out a column of vehicles, several of them military, and he relaxed. They would pass almost a kilometer away, so he decided to let them go before moving on. He watched them with detached interest, noting that the column consisted of close to 50 vehicles. As they drew closer, he began to make out people. Some were in military uniform, but many were wearing civilian clothing. They were too distant to make out any fine detail, but as the convoy began to stream past, he felt an uneasy feeling grow inside him, and he was suddenly very happy that he had stayed out of sight. Seeing the military wasn't entirely unusual. He had come across soldiers on exercise in the wastes several times over the past few years, but he had never seen them with large numbers of civilians before. Something about them didn't feel right. He waited until the convoy had passed and was slipping below the horizon before keeping his speed down to minimize dust. He left his doubts behind and headed onwards into the fading light to Silica City. It was a few hours before dawn when he next stopped and triple-checked his navigational plot. He looked out over the darkened desert ahead of him, thoroughly confused. He should have been able to see the lights of the town. Instead, he was looking out over a sea of inky blackness. It was as if the ground had opened up and swallowed the entire town of over 3,000 people. Must be a power failure, he thought to himself, but his logical mind wasn't accepting the answer he had given it. There were too many backup power systems for them all to fail at once. As he drove onwards, he crossed onto the rocky plain that he knew marked the border of the sand wastes, the end of the sand confirming what his navigation instruments were telling him. The town should have been visible. His alarm rose as he crossed the markers of one of the city's access roads, right where it should have been. The reflective markers, either side of the unpaved track, lighting up like a runway under his headlights. As he followed the road into Silica City, he racked his brain for every possible reason behind the lack of light, but none he could come up with could explain it. If there had been a chemical or biological hazard that had required the evacuation of the town, he would have seen military and civilian authorities enforcing a quarantine zone and cleaning up the spill. There were few, if any, bandits or criminal gangs inhabiting the wastes anymore, and even in the early days they were never strong or brazen enough to attack anything larger than a small, isolated settlement. As the first buildings loomed up out of the darkness in the headlights, his hand fell to the rifle lying next to him in the passenger seat. Something was wrong, very wrong. A vehicle was parked diagonally across the road, its doors open, while across its windscreen was a row of small holes. Saul recognized them instantly as bullet holes. With a flick of his wrist, he switched off the truck's headlights, the world falling dark. He reached behind him and grabbed another one of the items without which he never left his home, a pair of night vision goggles. Slipping on the compact device, Saul pulled over to the side of the track, and rifle at the ready slipped out into the early morning air. As he approached the car, the first thing to strike him was the appalling silence. The entire town beyond was as quiet as a tomb. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, the rapid beating of his heart making it hard to keep a clear line of sight through the rifle's scope. As he watched the buildings, half expecting some foul creature of the underworld to launch itself at him. He was more rattled than he could ever remember being in his life, and more than that, he was afraid. Part of him wanted to turn and run from the silent buildings in front of him and return to the safety of the sandy wastes, but he steeled his flagging nerves and crept forward. The world around him was made more eerie by the green hue through which he saw it, thanks to his goggles. the green effect caused by the chemicals in the optics that allowed the wearer to see even in absolute darkness. As he reached the civilian car, he gingerly took a closer look while keeping a wary eye on the surrounding street and buildings. The front of the vehicle was riddled with at least 10 bullets from what he could tell, and there were ominous, dark stains on the driver's seat. But there was no body. He sat and listened for a few minutes, but the buildings beyond remained shrouded in deathly silence. Saul weighed up his options. He could leave and return to his home, where his food supply would last perhaps another month, or he could push into the town and try to find out what had happened to the townspeople. Despite his near panic, he decided to push onwards and try to find both supplies and clues about what had happened. His mind made up, he quietly began working his way forward, deciding against driving in until he knew what he was up against. As he walked down the street, he checked the buildings quickly as he went. Some were locked, but others were wide open, household items scattered carelessly in the silent streets. By the time he had reached the center of town, the first rays of light were creeping over the horizon, the light falling on a scene of utter desolation. The town was full of signs of disorder. Rubbish and debris lay scattered where they had fallen or been blown by the wind. Many of the buildings' storm shutters and doors hadn't been closed when the storm had hit, and businesses and houses were partially filled with sand. Even with the thick layer of sand that coated the town from the storm, signs of chaos and panic were clearly evident. It was clear to Saul that a great, sudden, and terrible event had struck the town. It was also evident to him that whatever it was, he had missed it. As he slipped off his goggles in the rapidly growing light, Saul held his hand up. In it was one of a number of machine gun belt linkages that he had found scattered around the town. Automatic weapons had been fired, and yet as far as he could see, there were no bodies. Saul jogged back to his truck and drove it into the center of the town and parked it outside the main general store. He knew that he was in over his head and that he needed help. Someone had to know or be told about what had happened. He had checked the public communications hubs on the way in, but found that they had all been smashed and were useless. To his dismay, his emergency satellite communications set also seemed to be malfunctioning, the normally reliable device seemingly unable to pick up any of the myriad of satellites that he knew were in orbit. As he weighed up his options, he quickly stocked his truck with supplies just in case he needed to make a fast escape. He was just coming out of the store with the last of the supplies he had hurriedly sequestered when something caught his eye and he froze. On the horizon, rising above the buildings, was a column of thick, dark smoke. Something burning on Mars could only mean people, and he threw the last of the supplies into the truck's cabin and, quickly climbing onto the vehicle's roof to get a better view, brought his rifle's scope up to his eye. The smoke was distant, at least several kilometers, and was coming from one fixed location. Not that the smoke's unmoving position was surprising, he thought to himself. It wasn't like there was any wood to burn in the Elysium region of Mars. Coming to a snap decision, he jumped in his truck and headed toward the smoke plume, deciding that it was worth the risk to find out what was going on. As he drove carefully through the dead town, unseen on the passenger floor of his truck, his emergency satellite unit's small digital screen lit up. The device's roaming search function ending as it finally detected a satellite, the word "connected" flashing up on the screen. As he left the town's limits and passed out onto the rocky plain, he saw that the smoke was coming from the edge of the sand wastes. After 5 minutes, he approached the source of the smoke and immediately noticed an unnatural shape cut into the dunes. Someone had bulldozed a massive pit into the soft sand, and its contents were smoldering. As he drew closer to the pit, he saw it was filled with multicolored rags and debris, much of it blackened by the smoldering flames. He also noticed something odd. The sand around the edge of the pit was shiny and glinted in the strengthening sunlight. Saul halted close to the pit and jumped out for a closer look. As he knelt down, he stopped, the pit of his stomach sinking as if it had turned to lead. It wasn't the sand that was glinting. The area around the edge of the pit was coated with a thick layer of used linkages. The small disposable brass links that connected belts of caseless machine gun ammunition, turning the reddish sand golden. As he looked into the pit, he sank to his knees, the legs giving out from under him as in one long, terrible moment, the realization of what he was seeing came into sharp focus. The pit was filled with bodies, hundreds of them. The bodies were 3 and 4 deep. There were men, women, and children. their lifeless, pathetic forms discarded like rubbish. A small gust in the wind brought wafts of smoke in his direction, and the thick, sickly smell of burnt flesh and decay hit him like a slap across the face, and he vomited violently, his body reacting to his mind's shock and paralysis. As he tried to wipe the vile fluid from his lips, he couldn't take his eyes off the pit. Many of the bodies were blackened, and the shapes of skulls and rib cages could just be made out amongst the tangled mass of burnt flesh and fabric. Those on the edge of the flames were largely intact, and lifeless eyes stared skywards or at the other dead around them. Shock still registered on the faces. As he began to master his senses, Saul began to make out bullet wounds on some of the bodies. Faces caved in and chests ruptured from the destructive passage of high-velocity caseless ammunition. With effort, he staggered away from the ghastly pit, half crawling back to the truck, trying to keep out the smell while dry-reaching. He reached the truck and, leaning against it, took a moment to regain his composure. He forced himself to think. There had to be a logical explanation. His thoughts immediately turned to the military convoy he had seen the previous day. The idea of a Rouge military unit was unthinkable, and as far as he knew, virtually unheard of. Could it be something wider? A rebellion? The very thought was absurd. He knew or cared little for politics, and due to his isolated lifestyle, rarely kept up with events in the wider planet or system, but it still made little sense. The town had been virtually unarmed and was no threat to either a coup or those wishing to suppress one. What's more, there were far fewer bodies in the pit than there were people who had lived in Silica City. The sudden thought that there could be more pits amongst the sand made his stomach begin to churn once again, making him swallow hard. He had seen civilians with the convoy, but even at the extreme distance, they didn't seem to be being held prisoner. His head swam with the enormity of the situation he found himself embroiled in, a piercing headache materializing in an instant. He reached into the back of the truck and, pulling out a heavy-duty water bottle, took a swig, the lukewarm water tasting bitter in his throat. He was just about to lift the heavy container to his lips a second time when another sight made his stomach once again lurch. On the horizon was a plume of dust, the type of dust thrown up by vehicles moving at high speed. After a mad scramble to grab his rifle out of the truck, Saul sighted in on the dust cloud. Beneath it was a line of 4 vehicles. 3 were civilian, but one was some type of armored car he didn't recognize. All 4 were headed in his direction. Saul didn't know for sure that the vehicle's occupants were responsible for the massacre of the townspeople, but he wasn't waiting to find out. He threw the truck into forward and mashed the accelerator pedal, the heavy truck responding surprisingly quickly as it picked up speed in the soft sand thanks to its tank-like tracks. He had gone only a few kilometers when he realized that they had spotted him and were gaining fast. His truck made for rugged reliability and torque more than top-end speed. As they drew closer still, he heard the distinctive high-pitched crack of a high-powered bullet passing close by, and swerved as a volley of shots rippled past. Saul knew that their bad aim was a result of the bumpy terrain and distance, and he was fast running out of distance. With a heave on the steering wheel, he threw the heavy prospecting truck to the left and headed towards the roughest terrain he could see nearby, a patch of high dunes. He hit the first dune at an angle and skittered up its side like a running insect, several more bursts of automatic fire plowing into the dune around him. He realized that the dunes were moving in the direction of the regular winds, the effect creating a gentle slope facing the wind and an almost sheer dune face in the path of the sands march. Using the terrain to his advantage, he ran parallel along the top of the dune, effectively creating a smokescreen of dust before braking heavily and steering directly down the dune's steep face. The heavy truck slid down the dune, and as he hit the bottom, he mashed the accelerator, creating still more dust before continuing parallel along the bottom of the dune. Behind him, the first of the civilian cars crested the dune at full speed, through the dust cloud and catapulted over the dune's sharp edge. The lightly built vehicle came down nose first into the sandy gap between the dunes and impacted at full speed with an audible crunch. Due to the velocity, the sand acted not as a soft cushion, but as a solid mass, the car crumpling as if it had hit a wall of solid stone, killing the 4 occupants, none of whom were wearing the vehicle's safety restraints. A second civilian vehicle following close behind, the first realized the danger too late, and swerved hard. Its wheels bogged down as it turned, and it was sent cartwheeling over the dune face. The car rolled down the 30 feet of steep slope to the bottom before coming to a halt impaled in the soft sand. The remaining two vehicles changed course in time and ran along top of the dune, the occupants firing wildly at the truck below them. The first burst raked the back of the truck, the rounds stopped by the thickness of the metal in the reinforced rear tray. A second burst struck the cab and easily punched through the unarmored structure. To Saul, it seemed as if the truck's dashboard came apart in front of him as the dash instruments shattered, spraying shrapnel. Small pieces of metal and enviroplastic became embedded in his face, and bright arterial blood started running down his brow and into his eyes from a cut to his head. He almost lost control and the truck swerved violently, losing ground to its pursuers. He was steering up the next dune slope when the cabin was again strafed by concentrated automatic fire. He first saw holes appear in the roof, little beams of light suddenly appearing. A split second later, a round struck the steering column before passing through it and becoming embedded in his kneecap, another round entering his shoulder and smashing his shoulder socket. The whole world seemed to turn upside down as the truck went out of control and rolled, its momentum carrying it over the next dune and down the steep face. The violent motion ended with an equally violent crash, red dust obscuring everything. Saul opened his eyes, the fine gritty grains of sand scratching at his eyelids. He couldn't hear or feel anything, but his survival instincts took over, and, in a daze, he began to try to crawl out of the shattered vehicle's cabin, his subconscious telling him that he had to move. He had almost extracted himself when he heard a noise, a distant series of popping noises. He shook his head to clear his mind and some of the sand from his clogged eyes and ears. Then the sound came again. This time it was loud and followed by a series of metallic thwacks, and he realized it was the sound of gunfire hitting the truck. He knew he was hurt, but his mind was also telling him he had to act. Using his good arm, he reached back into the cab and dragged out his rifle, which mercifully seemed intact. He spotted movement along the dune crest above him and painfully swung the heavy firearm toward it. Against the light, he saw the silhouettes of people holding weapons. Using his bad arm as a prop, he sighted in at the closest shape and pulled the trigger, the rifle recoiling painfully into his shoulder. In an instant, the shapes all dropped from sight. He didn't know if he had hit anything, but it had bought him time. One-handed, he worked the bolt back and forward, the motion cycling the empty shell out of the breech and inserting a new one. Firing abruptly erupted from the dune, the air coming alive with flying projectiles, the sand around him being angrily kicked up. He swung the rifle to one of the flashes and, seeing a dark mass, fired. The shot was rewarded with a meaty thwack followed by a shape rolling down the dune. An object landed with a soft thud in the sand next to him, and he instinctively rolled away from it. The grenade went off with a loud crump, the explosive power largely absorbed by the soft sand. Saul desperately worked the bolt, and while blinking to clear the sand and blood in his eyes, chambered another round. Looking through the scope, he spied a man running to his right and dropped him mid-stride with a shot to the groin, the man crumpling over and disappearing from sight. He was just reaching for the bolt again when he felt a hammer blow to his chest and was knocked backward. He felt winded and tried to rise, but found he couldn't. His body refusing to answer his commands, his breathing instantly becoming heavy, like someone was sitting on his chest. He had dropped his rifle and desperately tried to reach for it, but his limbs were slow and lethargic, his movements uncoordinated. He had just about managed to grasp it when a boot appeared and pinned his hand to the ground. In a daze, he looked up and into the face of his attacker. The man was young. He guessed in his 20s. He wore an army uniform with combat webbing, but it had been dyed a reddish color, the camouflage pattern showing through the dye, making the uniform look dirty and patchy. The strangest thing, however, wasn't his uniform. It was his face. It was covered with tattooed glyph-like symbols Saul didn't recognize, while on his forehead was another symbol, this one crudely cut into the skin. Saul just stared at the man, speechless, both from the shock of blood loss and from the man's strange appearance. The man was holding an automatic rifle cradled casually, a sneer across his face, while at his side hung a wicked-looking, ceramic-bladed combat knife. The man hawked up his throat and spat a mouthful of phlegm onto the helpless captive at his feet before turning to speak to someone Saul couldn't see.
You know this unbelieving piece of shit?
Yeah, I've seen him around, a local prospector. He's nobody.
The bastard cost the cause 6 men and has many wounded.
Where he is going, an eternity of torment awaits. He will find judgment in the next world for his actions and for his rejection of the true path.
Saul's eyes rolled in his sockets as his mind tried to understand what was going on. He recognized the voice. It belonged to a shopkeeper from Silica City, someone he had bought a portable power pack and some other assorted items from in the past. He remembered that he had hated going to see the man, as he had always wanted to tell him about some religion that many of the town's people had been taking up over the past few years. Being a man of science and a very solitary individual, Saul had little interest in religious superstitions one way or the other, and had told the man so after he had persisted. Saul tried to arrange his thoughts into a cohesive pattern, but his body was failing, and they were fast becoming a jumbled mess in his head.
He is of no use to us. Kill him.
A cruel smile slid across the young soldier's face as he slung his rifle. It was the last thing Saul Milroy ever saw. In one smooth movement, the soldier drew his knife and plunged it through Saul's throat point first up to the hilt. Then with a twisting motion, he drew it back out. What little blood remained in Saul's ruined body soaking into the red sand. Wiping the blade on the body, the soldier sheathed it, and after a quick look over the wrecked truck, started back up the sand dune. He had a war to prepare for.